Welcome back after the break. You're watching Indus News, and I'm Fazad Jamal bringing you our main stories in detail. We start with the U.S.-Iran tensions, where President Donald Trump says the U.S. Navy shot down an Iranian drone in the Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, Iran's military says all of the country's UAVs have returned safely to base. Trump says the USS Boxer destroyed the Iranian aircraft when it came within 1,000 yards of the vessel. He says the drone was destroyed after it ignored multiple calls to stand down. Trump has called on other countries to condemn Iran and protect their own ships.
This is the latest of many provocative and hostile actions by Iran against vessels operating in international waters. The United States reserves the right to defend our personnel, our facilities, and interests, and calls upon all nations to condemn Iran's attempts to disrupt freedom of navigation and global commerce. I also call on other nations to protect their ships as they go through the strait and to work with us in the future.
Earlier, Iran said it seized a foreign tanker and its 12-member crew, alleging it was smuggling fuel into the Gulf. Washington has called on Tehran to release the tanker immediately. Now, in a related development, U.S. Central Command Chief General Kenneth McKenzie says Washington will work aggressively to enable free passage in the Gulf. Talking to reporters in Riyadh, McKenzie said the U.S. is working on an international maritime security coalition to ensure freedom of navigation. He says the U.S. does not seek a war with Iran, but will deter Tehran from destabilizing the region. The United States has beefed up its military presence in the Middle East following attacks on oil tankers in Gulf waters in recent months. Moreover, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani says all doors are open to save the 2015 nuclear deal. In a phone call with French President Emmanuel Macron, Rouhani said the EU should accelerate efforts to save the pact. Macron also called Russia's President Vladimir Putin to discuss the future of the deal after the US withdrawal. The Kremlin says both sides agreed safeguarding the deal is essential for peace in the Middle East. For more on this ongoing U.S.-Iran conflict, we are joined by Mr. James Dorsey, who is a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Mr. James, thank you for your time. So conflicting narratives keep pouring in from both sides over what has actually occurred during the past 2 months. Who do you think we should believe?
I'm not sure that we can believe either of the two parties at this point. Neither has a really credible record. What I do think is it's interesting that the Iranians clearly want to downplay the possibility of there having been a drone incident. With other words, which points to the fact that both parties, amid escalating tension and the risk that they cannot control this getting out of hand, both parties do not really want a military conflict or confrontation.
Right, and you know, General McKenzie said that the U.S. is working on an international maritime security coalition to ensure freedom of navigation. What are the chances of this escalating into violence in the region?
Basically, what that would mean is that you get the escorting of commercial vessels, oil tankers and others. That does not in and of itself necessarily have to lead to an escalation. It really depends on, in a sense, external factors. So, with other words, attacks on tankers that you've seen, including also now the holding of a commercial vessel by Iran, really are messages rather than attempts to escalate the situation, or responses to make clear that Iran will not stand by idly as an American-led coalition tries to contain it.
And Mr. James, from what you said before, sides say that they don't want war. Do you think they are making any efforts to stop that from happening?
Well, I think the problem with this is that it's sort of a tit for tat, if you wish. the Americans, egged on by the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Israelis, and by President Trump's own convictions that are long-standing, have taken what are very harsh measures against Iran, and Iran is fighting back. Now, having said that, that's a situation that in and of itself is not sustainable, and either gets resolved by negotiations or ultimately is likely to escalate.
Right. Thank you for your time, Mr. James Dorsey. Mr. James Dorsey, who is a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, joining us. Now we move on to Iraq, where Turkey has launched an air attack on Kurdistan region in response to the killing of its diplomat in Erbil. Turkey's defense ministry says the attack inflicted a heavy blow on Kurdish militants in northern Iraq. It says armaments, militant positions, and their shelters were targeted. This came after a Turkish diplomat was killed along with 3 others in a suspected Kurdish attack in the region. A Kurdish spokesman denied the group's involvement in the deadly shooting. Eight ISIS militants have been killed in fresh clashes in Iraq. 6 ISIS fighters were killed in a US-led airstrike in the northern province of Nineveh. 2 militants were killed and 4 others wounded in clashes with Iraqi soldiers in the eastern Diyala province. A spokesman for the US-led coalition in Iraq says it carried out an airstrike on an ISIS position in the Al-Baj area near Iraq's northern border with Syria. The coalition has carried out several anti-ISIS operations in northern and eastern Iraq in recent weeks. And 5 Houthi rebels and 3 government soldiers have been killed during violent clashes in the Yemeni port of Hodeidah. The government claims the fighting erupted after Houthi militia attacked areas under government control. Government forces say rebels have suffered heavy losses during the offensive that was aborted by the joint armed forces. The Houthi rebels have blamed pro-government forces for targeting residential areas in Hodeidah with mortar bombs. The confrontations came after both sides resumed negotiations to implement Hodeidah's Stockholm Agreement. The United Nations has reached an agreement. Pardon me, I'll move on to the next story. In Afghanistan, 8 people have been killed and over 30 others injured in a blast outside Kabul University. The explosion happened as a number of students were waiting outside the campus to attend an exam. Eyewitnesses say 2 vehicles caught fire after the explosion at the university entrance. No group has yet claimed responsibility. This comes a day after 12 people were killed in a car bomb attack in southern Kandahar. Nigerian rebels have killed 6 soldiers in an ambush in the northeastern state of Borno. Heavily armed ISIS militants attacked a vehicle patrolling near the Jakana army base. The Nigerian army says militants then attacked the base in 7 trucks fitted with machine guns. Soldiers were on their way to Maiduguri when the ambush happened. This came hours after a military chief in the northeast warned terrorists to disarm or face destruction. The scheduled talks between Sudan's military council and opposition alliance over a constitutional declaration have been delayed. The opposition alliance says the talks have been postponed indefinitely. No reasons for the delay were given. Earlier, the 2 sides signed a power-sharing deal after joint mediation by the African Union and Ethiopia. The accord stipulates the establishment of a joint sovereignty council of 11 members, including 5 civilians and 5 military representatives. 1 civilian member will be selected by consultation between the 2 sides. Now in Morocco, a court has sentenced 3 ISIS supporters to death. They were convicted of beheading 2 Scandinavian women on a camping trip to the country. Social media petitions have called for Abdes Samad Ejud, Yunus Uzayed, and Rashid Afati to be executed. The trial heard how ringleader Ejud and Uzayed beheaded the 2 women while Afati filmed. The verdict came at the end of an 11-week trial in the city of Saleh near the capital Rabat. The men claim to be ISIS supporters, but the terrorist organization denies involvement in the killings. Denmark's Louisa Vesterager Jespersen and Norway's Mare Nuland were found murdered in Morocco's High Atlas Mountains last December. Well, now we'll take a very short break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back after the break. We'll move on to our next story. DR Congo says the WHO naming of Ebola as a global emergency will harm its economy. The country fears the move will prompt neighboring states to close their borders, stopping the supply of goods and other products. More in this report.
The WHO has declared the Ebola virus outbreak in Congo to be a public health emergency of international concern. The move could encourage wealthy donor countries to provide more cash. But Congo fears its economy will suffer if neighboring countries impose travel and trade restrictions to counter the risk of the disease spreading.
The DRC should not close their borders. If the borders are closed, Rwanda will suffer a very negative impact on his economy.
African countries depend on imports from neighboring states, and the closure of borders is expected to affect the regional economy.
It's well known that Ituri, North and South Kivu provinces all rely on products from neighboring countries in east of Africa like Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania and Kenya.
The WHO has urged countries to keep transport routes and borders open while increasing surveillance at entry points. The global health body has appealed for more funds to quickly roll back the outbreak. The current epidemic in DR Congo has killed more than 1,600 people.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has met his German counterpart Heiko Maas to discuss the Ukraine crisis. The meeting was held on the sidelines of a 2-day bilateral forum in the German town of Königswinter. The German foreign minister says both sides differ on eastern Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. But Maas says no solution is possible without Russian involvement, so the 2 countries will work together to end the conflict. Relations between Russia and Germany have been strained since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. The ministerial-level meeting between Berlin and Moscow is the first since in 5 years. The conflict and annexation prompted Germany to sanction Russian companies. Incoming European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says the EU does not want a hard Brexit. The future EU chief hinted Britain may be given an extension in Brexit talks if London provides good reasons for it. She added an orderly departure was important to launch future ties on a good footing. In an interview, Leyen said the EU will wait for a new British Prime Minister to be chosen before pursuing talks. Earlier, British MPs voted to prevent a future Conservative leader from suspending Parliament to force through a no-deal exit. U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin has suggested in-person talks to resolve the trade row between the U.S. and China. In a telephone call with Chinese trade officials, Mnuchin said the Huawei issue will not be discussed at the possible trade discussions. Earlier, U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to impose further tariffs on Chinese imports. Beijing has demanded a fair and equitable deal to end the trade row between the 2 countries. South Korea says Japan has violated the principles of free trade and international law by imposing unilateral export restrictions. Seoul has also rejected Tokyo's call for third-party arbitration over a wartime labor dispute. South Korea's trade ministry asked Japan for another round of talks over Tokyo's tighter export controls. Meanwhile, Tokyo has summoned South Korea's ambassador amid heightened economic and political tensions. Japan's foreign ministry says Seoul must take swift steps to resolve the dispute. Tensions between the two sides have been escalating since Tokyo imposed restrictions on tech exports to South Korea. In retaliation, South Koreans have boycotted Japanese brands and canceled trips. In Taiwan, an artist in the village of Ruan Tiao is painting murals to ease loneliness for the elderly. Nestled in the foothills of Taiwan's central mountain range, the village is devoid of young people, and Wu Tsun Sin is filling the space with street art. More in this report.
Rapid economic growth has led to increased urbanization in Taiwan. This has left many villages without young people, but Wu is injecting life into the village by transforming local homes into a canvas of color.
This village is full of old people. These drawings attracted many tourists to come visit. The old people who were left here would not be so bored. This was my biggest gain.
Through his work, Wu highlights social problems, including climate change and corruption. There are some half a dozen graffiti villages in Taiwan that have been decorated with artwork in a bid to bring rural places back to life.
Taiwan has many graffiti villages that are beautiful, scenic spots where people would leave after taking pictures. But I realized when I came here that every mural here is depicting a social problem. The artist is trying to convey through irony these social problems to the younger generation.
He hopes to woo other young Taiwanese to explore rural villages more often.
Let's take you to the world of business, where Boeing says it will take a $4.9 billion hit to cover costs related to the worldwide grounding of its 737 MAX aircraft. The bulk of the money will be used to compensate customers for schedule disruptions and delays in aircraft deliveries. The hit will result in a $5.6 billion reduction in revenue and pre-tax earnings. The Boeing aircraft was grounded after crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia killed 346 people earlier this year. In a statement, Boeing said the aircraft will return to service in the last 3 months of 2019. The European Commission has imposed a fine of $272 million on U.S. chip-making giant Qualcomm in Brussels. This comes after Qualcomm stopped rivals from remaining in the market a decade ago. EU Antitrust Commissioner Margrethe Vestager says Qualcomm blocked competition by offering predatory prices between 2009 and 2011. The commissioner says that chips are the key components to connect mobile devices with the internet. Qualcomm said the company will file an appeal against the decision.
So today the Commission has decided to fine Qualcomm 242 million euros for an anti-competitive behavior that is illegal under EU antitrust rules.
Last year, the EU Commission fined Qualcomm $1.1 billion for paying iPhone to use only its chips. Asia-Pacific stock markets have risen over optimism that U.S. interest rates could be cut later this month. Mainland Chinese shares and Japan's Nikkei have gained significantly. Hong Kong's Hang Seng and South Korea's Kospi have enjoyed modest rises. In Australia, the ASX 200 also gained marginally. In Europe, stocks are trading higher across the board. Oil prices have bounced back in Asian trading after the U.S. said it shot down an Iranian drone in the Gulf. Overnight, stateside, the major indices saw the first gains in 3 sessions. Now let's find out what the weather will be like today around the globe. Well, these are all of our main stories in detail we have for you this hour. You can follow up on all of these stories. You'll find us online by the name of Indus.news.